Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you back to another edition of Books and Looks. Yes, this is our weekly look at a book I've been reading, an interview with the author, and then let's say a little bit of my perspective on something I've been looking at throughout the week. I thank you so much for following us, for joining us. I can't believe the numbers we're seeing this summer. Very gratifying, and we appreciate your continued following of Books and Looks. Before we get into the book, I want to remind you all that this is a book we're talking about today that will not be out for a few months. And so we've got a book review on my website, viewsonbooks.com. You can get a link to get pre-order of this book. I think you want to do that because it's a fantastic historical fiction book. Now let's talk a little bit about the book. Today we're talking about the book Reclaiming Mni Sota. Not Minnesota, but Mni, M-N-I, Sota, S-O-T-A. The author's name is Colin Mustful. Now, this is a historical fiction book, friends, and it's not just a historical fiction book. It is an alternate history. That's right, an alternate history of the US-Dakota War of 1862. Now, if you're like me, you probably have heard of Geronimo, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, Chief Joseph. You've heard of the Nez Perce. We've heard of the Apache, the Navajo, Custer's Last Stand. How many of you have heard of the Dakota Wars? I didn't. With the Ojibwe and the Dakota tribes, I heard nothing about it because it happened back in 1862. We were more concerned with the Civil War and keeping our country together, and so we didn't pay a lot of attention to what went on out in the area around Minnesota. And it's something that even as time goes by, we write about the Civil War, and then we jump over to the Custer battles and everything else and Geronimo, and we skip over this. So Colin Mustful has written a wonderful, I use that word a lot, I'm sorry, but it's just a wonderful book, a historical fiction book about an alternate history of this war. Now, what does he mean by an alternate history? Well, Colin's going to tell us how alternate history differs from revisionism, okay? And that's very important to know. What he does is a book about two people, basically, a young man from Vermont and a Native American from that Minnesota area. They call him Waabi, W-A-A-B-I, and Samuel. And we see this book through their eyes. Yes, the Dakota Wars is the backdrop, but it's more of a story about humanity and about what people were thinking and doing and the promises that the government made to both the settlers as well as to the Native Americans as to what was going to happen and how it didn't really happen that way. It's a book that is probably one of the most easy and fluid reads that I have read in a few years. I mean, it just flows. Colin has done a wonderful job with this book. It's 315 pages. The chapters are short and readable. And we go back and forth. One chapter might be Samuel, one chapter might be Waabi, and we go back and forth, and boy, oh boy, he immerses you in that story of the Dakota Wars. And again, something I don't know a lot about. Now, he's not going to give you heavy history, okay? It's all in there, okay? But it's not just going to be a recitation of facts, okay? It's going to be part of the overall story. And one of the things you're going to find out is the use of cranberries. That's right, cranberries is one of the things that was important and part of this Dakota War. I'd never heard of that, never knew it, and, Colin fills us in on this. He has given us all his background on this. He also, he has published this. He has his own publishing company, and that you're going to find out about, too. It's called History Through Fiction Publishing, and they have got some really good authors. Now, they're a small company, and they're not that old. I've read some of their books. Some of them I've reviewed already on my viewsonbooks.com. But there are fantastic authors who give really good history, who use history to tell the story. Not just, oh, there it is, okay? There was an Indian. No, it's all part of the story. And so this is a website you might want to check out. This is History Through Fiction, okay? And you want to look at his website. He's going to tell us all about that. But this is a very fine book that I think you want to pay attention to. As I said, it's an alternate history. So we've never done this before, So I'm really looking forward to it. Let's go right into our interview with Colin Mustful. Colin, welcome to Books and Looks.
Thank you so much, Blaine. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I tell you, I've been a fan of yours for a long time, and we'll get into how I knew about you in a few minutes. But before we get started, Colin, where are you from? Where did you go to college? A little bit of your background. Did you study writing or history when you were in college?
Well, I'm from Minnesota, grew up in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. I went to several universities. The first one was Bethany Lutheran College down in Mankato, Minnesota, south of the Twin Cities. Then I went out to Salem, West Virginia, to Salem International University. That's where I got a Bachelor of Arts in Liberal Studies. Then I returned to Mankato and attended the state university there, Minnesota State University, Mankato, to get a graduate degree in history. And that's actually what launched me down the path that I'm on now about writing about the US-Dakota War of 1862. And then I returned to school in 2017 to get a graduate degree in a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from Augsburg University in Minneapolis.
Wow. Well, you got a lot of degrees, you got a lot of the background, and I tell you, it shows in your writing. But before we get into the book, there's a little bit about you that I find absolutely fascinating, and that's that you own your own publishing company called History Through Fiction. Could you tell everybody about that?
Definitely. It is a long story. I'll try to condense it a bit. But, I started writing novels back in 2010 is when I first started writing a novel. And I actually didn't understand how complicated fiction is. As I mentioned, I had a degree in history and I had an interest in history, and I wanted to share the US-Dakota War with people and wanted them to know about that history. And I decided to use fiction to tell the story because fiction, there's a lot of power in storytelling, and I wanted to utilize that power to share this history with a broader range of people that might not be interested in traditional nonfiction texts. Well, over the years of writing fiction about the US-Dakota War, I learned that I still had a lot to learn about how to utilize craft elements of fiction in order to engage readers in the story. And so that's why I went back to school in 2017 to get an MFA in creative writing. And during my MFA program, I also took a concentration in publishing. And I did that because in addition to learning a lot about how to write, I also learned a lot about how to publish. Going back to 2013, I actually signed my first publishing contract with a company called Tate Publishing. And what I didn't realize at the time was that they're a vanity press that essentially exploit first-time authors. And they required a $4,000 retainer fee in order to publish my novel with them. And in return, they promised to put forth $27,000 towards the publication of the novel and its design and its editing and its marketing. But they, as far as that retainer fee goes, the only way to get it back was if you sold 1,000 copies of your novel. And at the time, I had no idea that was a lot of books. I didn't have any way to gauge how many sales I would have on the book. I thought, okay, if they're going to put all this money into the book, it should sell 1,000 copies. But what I also didn't realize is that quota, any books that I bought from them and then sold in person did not count toward that quota. And they didn't market the book to an audience of potential readers. They marketed it to me. They wanted me to buy the book, and they said, well, if you buy it from us and then sell it in person, you'll make more money off each sale. So it was a bad experience, but I learned a lot about the publishing process, and it also motivated me to learn more about what it means to identify a target audience and build an online presence. And so I was able to learn and grow not just in the writing process, but in the publishing process. And as I got out of my MFA program and had this concentration in publishing, I decided to use all that knowledge and experience to launch History Through Fiction. And another reason I did it is because I have a somewhat of a unique brand of historical fiction because I'm not interested in just having historical backdrops. As a reader, I really want to learn about real history and real people. And when I write my historical fiction, if you look back at my novels, Fate of the Dakota, Grace at Spirit Lake, and Seeding Contempt, you'll see things like endnotes. Seeding Contempt actually has footnotes and fiction. And when I have submitted those to publishers, they all say, well, fiction can't have footnotes. Fiction can't have a bibliography. And I say it can. And I'm still learning how to do that in a way that doesn't disrupt the reader from the fictional dream, but still gives them a certain amount of transparency about what the historical fiction author is doing, what's fact and what's fiction, and kind of giving the historical author a little bit more credit, because I can tell you as a historian, they're doing just as much work as any scholarly historian is doing in writing their historical novels, and in some cases even more when you consider all the nuances of historical fiction that the historical novelists have to know, as all the way down to the type of underwear that people were wearing at a certain period. So with all those things in mind, I decided to create history through fiction and publish historical novels that fit my interests and my niche and my brand. And it's been a challenging but rewarding experience so far.
Well, I've read some of your authors' books, and I've found them very, very fine. I would recommend anybody to go to the website, take a look at the books. They're outstanding books, are well-written and well-edited. And, Steve Berry does the exact same thing on all his books. And at the very end, he puts down what's fact and what's fiction. And, of course, when you're Steve Berry and you're selling the number of books he's putting, the publishers listen to that, But, yeah, I like that. But I think a reader appreciates that, knowing what is true, and what are we using, and what's not, and what's the fiction part of it. And again, wonderful stuff. And for all of you, I really would invite you to go to his the Colin's History Through Fiction .com website, because it's a wonderful site. And as a matter of fact, there's something that you started that at least I just found out. You host Zoom calls or Zoom discussions on historical fiction with other novelists. Is that correct?
Yes, it's called What's New in Historical Fiction, and it's a regular panel series that features historical novelists with new and upcoming titles. Each panel is 3 to 4 authors, and it's authors that have books that are coming out that particular month. So, in fact, I'm doing one next week. We're recording this in July. I'm hosting one on July 26th. It's got 4 great authors, and they all have historical novels that are coming out either this month or next month. And it's free for people to attend, and they're all about 1 hour long. And I just moderate the panel by asking each of the authors to talk about their books, and then inviting Q&A from the audience.
That's a very nice thing. Again, that's a great resource for everybody, and I know I'm looking at the website as we're talking right now, and I got to register, so I want to be on that one and start doing that more and more regularly, because I think that's great. As a matter of fact, I look at one here immediately that catches my eye by Laura Morelli called The Lost Masterpiece. I love art and everything, so that caught me right away. So I'll be there with you, Colin, okay? Now, let's talk a little bit about the Dakota Wars, because I'm going to be honest with you. I know Geronimo. I know the Apaches. I know Red Cloud's War. I know Custer, the Nez Perce, Chief Joseph, Quanah Parker. The Dakota Wars, I don't know anything about that. And when I start talking to people, Colin, they don't know about the Dakota Wars. So could you give us a little bit about that, and what was the outcome?
Sure. Well, what's generally called the Indian Wars occurred from 1862 with the US-Dakota War to 1890 with Wounded Knee is generally when it's considered those Indian Wars ended. And it covers all that history that you just kind of mentioned. As far as the US-Dakota War is concerned, it involved the Dakota people whose traditional homeland is in the region that we now call Minnesota. And over a period of several hundred years, the Dakota were signed several treaties. I mean, first it started with the fur trade, establishing relationships with the French and then the English, and then eventually with the United States after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. The first treaty between the U.S. and the Dakota people was signed at Bedote, the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, just a few miles from my home, and that was signed in 1805. And then there were several treaties after that. Eventually, there were these things called land cession treaties in which the Dakota agreed to give up portions of their land in exchange for annuity payments, annual cash payments, goods and services. And all that was predicated on the fur trade that kind of made them reliant on these products and services that the government and that contractors provided. It was all really a part of capitalism, to be totally honest with you. But in any case, by 1851, the Dakota signed the treaties of Traverse des Sioux and Mendota, in which they agreed to sell their lands west of the Mississippi River in exchange for a reservation along the Minnesota River Valley, starting in New Ulm, Minnesota, and going all the way to the Dakota border. And the conditions on the reservation were not good. There were some what are called Farmer Dakota that agreed to make these changes that the United States government was trying to force the Dakota to assimilate to a white or Western culture. And then other Dakota who did not agree to these changes, did not agree to the terms of the treaty, and they're generally called the traditional Dakota. By 1862, the reservation had been cut in half, and the Dakota, a faction of them decided to fight back by launching an attack at what's called the Lower Sioux Agency against the settler colonialists that lived there and the agency government officials that lived there. And the attack was originally successful for the Dakota. They took about 250 people captive. They killed between 400 and 800 settler colonialists throughout south and southwestern Minnesota. And there wasn't much the U.S. Army could do about it because this was in the middle of the Civil War. So what the governor of the state of Minnesota, Alexander Ramsey, did is he got the former governor, Henry Sibley, to organize a volunteer militia, train them at Fort Snelling in St. Paul, and there was about 2,000 men in this volunteer militia. They headed south and were able to put down this uprising, these attacks, and eventually force the Dakota to flee or surrender. As a result, all of the Dakota, many of whom did not take part in the conflict, were sent to an internment camp, often called a concentration camp, at Fort Snelling. And then 400 Dakota were put on trial for their roles in the US-Dakota War. 303 of them were determined to be guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. President Abraham Lincoln lessened many of those sentences down to only 38 that were eventually hanged in Mankato, Minnesota on December 26, 1862. Then in 1863, all of the Dakota and Ho-Chunk people who were living south of Mankato were exiled from the state of Minnesota by law forever and sent to Crow Creek, South Dakota.
Okay, well, now, this gives you the background for wanting to write a book. And now what I find fascinating is you're writing a book which you call an alternate history versus a revisionist history. What's the difference between the two, Colin?
Well, first, this is all part of my journey, starting as a historian, then moving to fiction. And then it was pretty difficult for me to actually go into alternate history, being that I have so much integrity for the historical process. Revisionist history, and I can't give a definite answer on that, but revisionist history is just taking a new look from a broader perspective, through new sources, with new consideration for all the different context that's involved in history that has often been overlooked or ignored, leading up to this point in time. And so it's a way of revising history with some new standards. Alternate history is to actually change the outcome of history, and it's used in science fiction a lot. My attempt wasn't to create a science fiction. I did this as a way to illuminate all the wrongs that were done to the Dakota and Ojibwe people by having those same wrongs done to the white settler colonialist populations, as a way to maybe help people relate to what happened and then empathize with the Dakota and Ojibwe people and come to a better understanding of how those historical events, if we flip them on their head and change them around, show the reader just how much history is connected to who and what we are today.
Right. Well, you did a fine job. But you know what's funny? The Dakota Wars is the background here, Colin. But to me, this is a book about two different people. This is a book about a Ojibwe Indian named Waabi. We shortened his name to Waabi, and a young man from up in Vermont called Samuel. You want to tell us about the two of them?
Sure. Well, that was another challenge for me as an author because, again, I'm obsessed with history, and my earlier novels have too much informational text. And so the first half of this novel, Reclaiming Mni Sota, is really just character background. You're getting to know these two characters so that by the end, you can empathize with their situations. So Samuel is a young man who lives in Vermont. He's from Londonderry, Vermont, and I actually chose Londonderry because I lived there briefly while I worked at a ski resort in Vermont. And he and his family are down on their luck, and like so many other families, they decide to head west for all the open land and kind of for a new start. And they don't know much about the history of Minnesota and about it being the homeland of the Dakota. All they know is that the Indians, the Dakota people, have been put onto a reservation and that the land is now free and open for settlement. So they head out there with ambitions and hopes and dreams and just try to start a new life for themselves. Waabi, he lives at Madeline Island, and that's the traditional homeland of the Ojibwe people who had migrated there several centuries early and settled there because it was foretold to them as they would resettle in the place where food grows on water or wild rice. And so the Ojibwe settled there around 1600 and then spread out south and west, eventually getting into northern Minnesota and eventually pushing some of the Dakota south during the mid-1700s. Now, so Waabi, he lives at Madeline Island and life is good, but this is 1850s when white settlement is increasing. Not so much just for land to live on. What the U.S. government was interested in were the resources. They wanted the timber resources and they wanted the mineral resources, specifically copper, along the southern shore of Lake Superior. So Waabi sees his life changing dramatically and quickly. Many of his family members perish. His father dies at the Sandy Lake tragedy of 1850, which is him. The character is fictional, but the Sandy Lake tragedy is very much real. And 400 Ojibwe died at Sandy Lake because of the negligence of the United States government there in 1850. So Waabi is kind of, he doesn't know what to do next. And then the war breaks out, and Waabi and Samuel are both just kind of innocent victims in something that's much larger than themselves. And that's where the plot thickens.
Right, and that's well done. And when you read this book, it starts out one chapter on Waabi, one chapter on Samuel, one chapter Waabi, back to Samuel, back and forth. Now, you sort of answered one of my questions about Londonderry and the lumber mill, because I felt I was there in that lumber mill with Samuel. Were you ever worked in a lumber mill or just a ski resort?
Just a ski resort. I will say that on my own, I'm not very creative. So anything you find in my novels, I found somewhere else. Something else inspired me. So Londonderry, for instance, I chose that because I did live there. Most of my research is done with primary source materials that are now digitized. As far as the sawmills and lumber mills go, well, the sawmilling was very popular here in Minneapolis. It's one of the reasons the city came to be. And there's actually a lot of resources available online from historic mills that give you all that information. So yeah, I mostly just did online research to recreate the sawmill.
Well, I thought I was there. I understood exactly what was going on, the frustrations, the problems they have in that. And having had asthma myself as a child, I know that one of your characters does have asthma, and that's a problem. So It's a very realistic book. And, friends, it's a fluid book. It flows. It is easy to read. It is packed with details, but not as condensed. As Colin said, his first books are a little more jam-packed with fact. You get a lot of facts, but it's so well written, you almost don't realize you're learning at the same time. That's a great style, Colin.
Thank you. Well, it took a lot of years and a lot of revising and a lot of editing, a lot of taking a lot of advice and criticism in order to accomplish that. So I'm glad to hear you say that. I put in a lot of hard work and time to accomplish that.
Now, when did you start writing the book? You said it took you years.
I started this one in June of 2018. It was an assignment for my summer residency. We had to write a short story, and I wrote it as a short story. That it was just kind of a small idea in my mind. I'm not sure where I was going to go with it, and it just grew from there.
Had you always planned it to be an alternate history novel?
Yes, I think so. I just had that idea of having a white settler and a native, whether it be a Dakota or an Ojibwe, and I wanted a way to show both of their perspectives, because there is still a lot of I don't know if it's animosity or feelings of loss, feelings of resentment about the US-Dakota War, and who was right, who was wrong, and you'll find that in online comments. I find that when I go to speaking engagements and hear from one side or the other, and so I'm just trying to show an objective view that is relatable, that shows people as truly human, and that no one is specifically at fault. It was just a confluence of many different factors.
That's correct. Now, we don't want to give away the ending of the book, because the book actually hasn't come out yet. So, but we're getting Colin on here because I'm getting ready for my summer break in a few weeks. I wanted to get him on because I just love this book. And one of the characters, Samuel, this young man from Vermont, he carries along the whole time that I get to the end a feeling that every bad thing that happened to his family is all his fault. And yet when I read it, I got more issues with Thomas than I do with Samuel. What's your feeling about the Samuel-Thomas relationship?
Well, that was another fictional element of just trying to... Everyone has challenges with their family and with their family members. And so Samuel is the bigger brother to Thomas, and Samuel he's the eldest in the family, and he wants what's best for everybody. And of course, back in that time, there was a lot more responsibility put on children at earlier and earlier ages, and so he just has that firstborn mentality of he can't just be a son; he has to be kind of the dad too, kind of help out his parents a lot. And Thomas is not about that. He is a little more freewheeling, a little more carefree, and so that creates some friction. And I just tried to do my best to show it as a natural sibling relationship.
Now, I know you gave us a good history and background of that, of the whole situation up there in the Dakota area, but yeah, how many peace treaties were actually made and broken or modified? But 2, 3, 5, how many did that happen?
Well, honestly, hundreds.
Oh my.
If we're speaking just between regarding Dakota and Ojibwe, there's actually a great book by Martin Case. It's called The Relentless Business of Treaties, and that gives you a really good idea of all of the economic factors that were involved in making these treaties, and in the business people, essentially businessmen at that time, who were making these treaties because it benefited their businesses, as in the steel industry and the railroad industry and whatever industries they were in. In the case of Minnesota, Henry Sibley, he was a fur trader. He came to Minnesota in 1834, and he was the most prolific fur trader, worked for the American Fur Company. And it was in his best interest to make these treaties in order to settle debts that the Dakota couldn't pay back with cash or with furs, because the furs actually were losing value. And so he was in charge of the treaty in 1851 in order to settle his debts, in order to get rich out of it, frankly, and also to help his employees in the American Fur Company. And so each one of the treaties was really, it was a business deal that was advantageous toward the white capitalist businessmen, and they never had any intentions of doing right by the Dakota or by the indigenous populations of the United States. And there may have been, a few men here and there, certainly some of the missionaries, certainly somebody like George E.H. Day, who was a special agent assigned to investigate some of the corruption in the treaty system. There were some good people trying to help the Dakota, but for the most part, it was just about economics, about making some money, and the Dakota and Ojibwe were on the wrong end of that.
Yeah, and I think we've seen if you go back to looking at old cowboy movies and things like that, you see what is also there, just a little bit of what you touch upon, is that the money that they were promised, the allotment of goods and foods that they were promised, never came through. And it forced these poor people to take action eventually.
Well, and even if it did come through, there were other means and methods of contractors, of liquor salesmen to get their hands on that money before the native peoples had a chance to use it.
I read a fascinating book. Oh my, now I can't remember the title, but it had to deal with the life on an Indian reservation out in the New Mexico region or Arizona, and the number of state permitted liquor stores right at the edge of the Indian reservation. Like they had permitted 99 there, and they were supposed to have 12. And this, I think, happened everywhere. And this is a real problem that was created. We created it. So, this is interesting stuff. It's a very interesting book, interesting read. Now, cranberries. I got to get to cranberries. That is one of the greatest things I've read about the wars and the conflicts. Tell us a little bit about cranberries.
Well, in the novel, Samuel's family discovers a cranberry patch when they first settle in southern Minnesota, and it helps them get by during their first winter. And the Dakota approach them as they're heading to market in the spring, and not to give, like you said, not to give too much away, but there's a conflict there about who has the rights to the cranberries.
But then it comes back again, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, it comes back in the epilogue, and that was a way for me to tie things together. In the epilogue, we shoot forward into present day, and Minnesota is Mni Sota Makoche. It's a native held and governed land, and the reader kind of gets to see what that might look like, at least in my imagination and based on sources that I was able to bring together. But as far as the idea for using the cranberries, that came from a book called Old Rail Fence Corners, and those are pioneer tales told by Minnesota pioneers. And so these are in the 1850s, these pioneers that all came to Minnesota, traveled from the east and gave up everything to start a new life. Well, their stories are all compiled in this book, and in one of them they found a cranberry patch, and that's where I got the idea.
Are there a lot of cranberries in Minnesota?
I don't think so. I had never come across a cranberry patch, but they did, and so I used it.
Just didn't know. I just didn't know. But I love the fact you used cranberries. That was really, really great. Now we see where it comes from a historical situation. It's just well done. And again, the thing that hit me a lot was that this family in Vermont was basically lured out there by the U.S. government. Oh, we've got free land. You're going to have all sorts of riches, all sort of prosperity. Boy, they sold them a bill of goods, didn't they?
They did. And as I've already mentioned, it's really all about capitalism. As I write in the novel, it's about manifest destiny, the belief that white settlement was destined by God to move across the entire continent or at least what would become the United States. And that was a part of it, just advertising and flyers, and I'm sure you can look up online and find original flyers like the one that Samuel holds in his hand in the novel, and that promote that. And in fact, a part of the chapter with Waabi's perspective is set in 1855 at Madeline Island. Well, there was a new lock and dam built at Sault Ste. Marie in 1855 that allowed steamships then to travel further west into Lake Superior. And that honestly led to a lot of tourism. And that's what Waabi finds, is these tourists that come to his island. And he's like, who are these people and what are they doing here? And that's real. That happened in 1855, and all kinds of Eastern tourists came, and they wanted to see the frontier.
Well, yeah, friends, if you're reading this book, I want to tell you, it has the Dakota Wars, as I said, in the background. But this is more about humans. It's about humanity. It's about innocent people on both sides suffering. Am I reading that the right way?
Yeah. It's about creating a way to relate to something that happened now a century and a half ago, but that everything, the emotions are still real and the experiences are still real and hopefully somewhat relatable.
Here's a question for you. Speculative. Okay. We've got, and you have to understand, friends, this was taking place in 1862 when the U.S. was involved in the Civil War. Eventually, we have the Dakota Wars in Colin's book, and we have a new treaty, which sets up an area, okay? Do you really think the U.S. government would have stood by that treaty?
Are you talking about in the novel?
Yeah, the novel, the one that after your alternate Dakota War, do you think the U.S. government, with all the settling of Minnesota, of the Montana, of the Dakotas, the development of the Gatling gun, the machine guns, and everything else, do you think they really would have abided by that treaty?
Well, one thing in fiction that every author asks their readers to do is to suspend their disbelief for a little bit. And hopefully I've set up the novel well enough that people can engage into the story and suspend their disbelief. And that was the goal, to create something that wouldn't happen, but to make it just plausible enough, to make it just relatable enough that it gets people to think, well, what if? And in fact, even the idea in there that the native peoples, the Ojibwe and Dakota, are traditional enemies, and there were rumors at the time that they were colluding to get together, but that was never going to happen. So it is kind of a fantastical idea, but like I said, it's all about just creating something that is thought provoking. Right.
Well, and the thing is, let's go ahead, and not your book, but another book I just read by a gentleman named Chris Wimmer. I don't know if you're aware of Chris. He's a Western guy, called The Summer of 1876, that deals with some of it deals with Custer and the battle out there, but they had the same thing. The different tribes consolidated. They knew something was happening. So people who were not necessarily allies were actually coming together, banding together. And as I'm reading that book, I'm reading your book, I say, oh my God, it's like the exact same thing, but yours was a few years ahead of it. Amazing.
Well, that was 15, 16 years on into those Indian wars when, the tribes decided they needed to come together to fight the relentless force of westward settlement. And
Well done. Now, here we go. Question for you. What's coming up next for Colin Mustful? Are you going to be writing a new book, or are you writing a new book? And or are you going to be concentrating more on the publishing end of things right now?
Well, I would absolutely love to write a new book, but I can't right now. So History Through Fiction, I started in 2019. I didn't know where it would go, But it's growing, as you talked about. I have that Zoom panel series. Well, I have an awful lot more than that. I have my own podcast, a blog. We publish short stories. We're running a short story contest this summer, and it is a full-time job, and I can barely keep up with it. In addition to that, I'm doing a lot of freelance editing just to bring some income in, and that's all keeping me very busy. And also, I work. Like I work at a school, so I'm lucky right now that I have the summer off, but I work as a special ed para, and I also do pizza delivery, and that's been a great blessing because of that tip money I use to help sustain me and help invest into the business. But I've established a brand, and people seem to like it, and so I'm going to continue to try and grow that brand and see where it takes me.
Well, like I said, I've read some of your authors' works. I found them very, very fine. And I even wrote you hoping that we'd know more. Are they going to come up with another book? I keep waiting for more books from your company. And I'm hoping we'll see even more and more coming out from you. So, well, I'll tell you what, friends, again, go to historythroughfiction.com. You will see a host of things you want to get involved with. Maybe you want to write some fiction. Maybe you want to read his blog. Join in the panel. Watch these and it's a monthly panel on historical fiction writers. It's a lot you can do. There's a lot you can learn. And I'll tell you what, Colin, thank you. Thank you so very much for coming on today. Thank you for starting History Through Fiction. Thank you for this wonderful book, Reclaiming Mni Sota. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Blaine. This has been a wonderful conversation. I'm just so glad for your interest in my work and that you're helping me share it with readers.
All right. Very good. Friends, I'll be right back in a minute. Well, thank you again, Colin. That was really enjoyable. I'm telling you, folks, you really want to go out and read this book. It's well done, and it's a type of historical fiction that you don't read every day of the week. What I also like about it is he gets it done in a nice, neat, and clean 315 pages, okay? None of these 1,000-page tomes, which I can barely make it through half of the book. So, very good book, really great job. Looking forward to more from Colin and his History Through Fiction publishing company. Now, what am I looking at this week? And this week, I am looking at coffee. That's correct. I'm looking at coffee. A couple reasons for that. The first reason is that, all these wealthy, bigwig, multi-gabillionaires, they got together out at Sun Valley for a retreat. Oh, they love getting together to be with their own kind. And so when out there, Warren Buffett was there with his wife. Now, I don't know if you read about this, but Warren's wife, Astrid, went out with him. She doesn't usually go to these things. She stays home in Nebraska. But she went with him this time, and she was appalled and offended because someone was going to charge her $4 for a cup of coffee. Astrid, I'm with you 100%. No cup of coffee is worth $4. No. We have been conned by the Starbucks of the world. We've been conned by the specialty coffees of the world that unless you spend more, you cannot get a quality cup of coffee. Okay. Folks, what does a quality cup of coffee taste like? Do you know anything about the flavors of the coffees? Or are you just going to Starbucks because, well, it's trendy? That's what everybody does. Did you know that the average cup of coffee in America right now costs $4.90? The word obscene comes to mind. That's almost as much as what the average price for 1 gallon of gas cost a few years ago. But we all moaned and groaned, bitched and chewed about the cost of gasoline, but boy, we kept buying that coffee. If you put the equivalent amount of coffee into a gallon of gasoline, that cup of coffee equivalence is the effect of, I think, $36 or $38. Yeah, but you don't mind that because it's Starbucks. It's a cup of coffee, and we want to have that. When I was working, I took a thermos with me. Yep, made my coffee in the morning, took a thermos with me to work. Boy, that was economical. To this very day, we make our coffee here at home. And I don't need to make those espressos. I have some if I want some. Guests seem to like it, but I don't need to make them. I don't mind having a regular cup of coffee. That's fine. $4, $5, some cups of coffee as much as $13, $14, $15? Really? You have nothing better to do with your money than spend $13 plus on a cup of coffee? Well, shame on you. Shame on you. And shame on these billionaires that I just can't stand them because they're just, such conspicuous consumption all the time. Astrid, I'm with you. Then, by the way, when I talk about coffee, let me give you a show you want to watch on Netflix. The show is called Would You Like a Cup of Coffee? And, of course, it's a South Korean show. It's a 26-minute show. I think there are 12 episodes. It's fantastic. It's about a little coffee shop in Korea. I learned a lot about coffee, I'll be very honest with you. But it's just all the little things that go on, the people in the coffee shop. And it's, it's just a wonderful and delightful little show, which if you have, sometimes you want to sit down for an hour, hour and a half. I have 30 minutes. Watch Would You Like a Cup of Coffee? You're going to love it because it's really, really a fine show. And it's one of the reasons I've been concentrating on coffee, along with the fact that Astrid and I apparently see eye to eye on what is the proper price for a cup of coffee. Anyway, that's it for this week. Come back next week. We're going to have a very special guest who's in the book industry with us next week. And until that time, on behalf of viewsonbooks.com, on behalf of Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis for Books and Looks saying, may all your leaves be pages in a book.